The morning the grid went quiet was the morning Mara Voss stopped being afraid of water. She was standing barefoot in the wet sand when the lights died. Every light for 40 miles in every direction, all of them snuffed at once like a hand had passed over a birthday cake. She felt it before she saw it. A pressure change. Something moving through the salt air that wasn't wind. The Atlantic stretched out in front of her, gray and indifferent. And for a moment the only sounds were the tide dragging itself back across the sand, and the distant pop of a transformer somewhere up the coast taking its last breath. Then her phone screamed. Not a ringtone, not an alert. It was a sound that shouldn't have been possible, a sustained modulated tone cycling up through registers no mobile speaker was built to produce, the kind of frequency that lives at the edge of hearing and behind the eyes. She dropped it. It kept screaming in the sand. She picked it up because she was still, at that point, a woman who picked up her phone when it rang, and the screen showed her nothing but a waveform pulsing white on black, expanding and contracting like something breathing. Then it spoke. Not words. Not quite. A structured sequence of compressed tonal pulses, mathematically spaced, that her brain kept trying to parse into syllables the way it finds faces in static. She stood there in the wet sand with the Atlantic behind her, and whatever this was pressing against her eardrums, and she thought, with a clarity she hadn't felt in 3 years, Cale built this. That idiot built a door and something walked through it. Cale Renner had been her boyfriend in the way that complicated, brilliant people sometimes become your boyfriend. Gradually, accidentally, and at significant cost to your emotional infrastructure. They'd met in a graduate acoustics lab at 19, when she was studying the physics of sound propagation, and he was trying to patent a method for encoding data in subsonic frequencies. He had the kind of mind that couldn't sit still, restless, compulsive, always pushing one more centimeter past the edge of the possible. She had loved that about him. She had also, eventually, left him because of it. The project he'd been working on when she ended things was called Resonance Bridge. He'd explained it to her a dozen times with the slightly manic energy of a man who'd stopped sleeping properly. The theory was elegant if you squinted at it, that certain electromagnetic frequencies, specifically those in the 3 to 8 Hz range, where the Earth's own resonant cavity operates, could be used as a carrier wave for information. Not radio, not microwave. Something deeper, something that moved through the planet itself, the way sound moves through bone. He thought he could build a communication system that was essentially unjammable, undetectable, and global. She'd asked him what he planned to communicate with. He'd smiled in that way he had, crooked and slightly embarrassed, and said he was still working on that part. That had been 3 years ago. 3 years in a grief she hadn't finished processing. Her mother, gone in the summer, drowned in the shallows of this same beach, when a rip current took her from behind on a clear August morning. Mara had been 20 meters away. She'd seen it happen. She'd stood chest-deep in the water while her mother went under, and she had not been able to make herself go deeper, because the ocean had always been the thing that filled her chest with cold concrete. And that day, she had failed in the most permanent way a person can fail. She hadn't been back to this beach since the funeral. She was here now because Cale had called her at 4 a.m. 2 days ago. And he'd sounded different. Not excited different, not the patent came through different. Scared different. She'd driven 6 hours to his lab in the converted warehouse outside Gloucester, and found him sitting on the floor surrounded by equipment she half recognized and half didn't. His hair 3 weeks past a haircut, with burn marks on his left hand he couldn't adequately explain. He'd shown her the recordings. The resonance bridge had worked. It had been working for 11 days, and something had been answering it. The recordings were not audio files in any standard sense. Cale had to walk her through the visualization software he'd built to render them as waveforms, because played through speakers they produced that same pressure behind, the eye's sensation that made the room feel smaller. What she was looking at, once she understood the display, was structured, deeply, intricately structured. Not the structured noise of weather systems or seismic activity. Mathematical structure, recursive, self-referencing. A signal that contained, folded within it, earlier versions of itself. It was not a greeting. She understood that before Cale said it. Whatever this was, it wasn't reaching out. It was cataloging. It started as a response, Cale told her, pouring coffee he immediately forgot to drink. Pure mirroring. I send a pulse, it sends the pulse back. Same frequency, same duration. I thought it was reflection, multipath propagation, you know the phenomenon. Then on day 3 it started modifying the reflection, adding harmonics, like it was. Annotating what? Me, the signal, the origin point. He looked at his burnt hand. I think it's been mapping us. The building. The power grid. I think it's using the electrical infrastructure the way we use fiber optic lines. Moving through it. Seeing through it. She'd asked the obvious question, what is it? He'd said he didn't know. But he'd said it the way a person says they don't know, when they have a very strong suspicion they're not ready to voice out loud. The next morning the grid went down, and Mara was standing on the beach when her phone played her that sound. And she'd known then that the question of what it was had become significantly less important than the question of what it wanted. It killed Kale on a Thursday. She didn't witness it directly. She was in the parking structure adjacent to his building when every light in the structure strobed simultaneously at a frequency that sent her to her knees. And when she got back to the lab 20 minutes later, Kale was on the floor and the equipment surrounding him was slag. The burn pattern on the concrete around his body was radial. Epicenter at his workstation, blast geometry that suggested something had discharged through the power conduits in the wall, through the equipment, through him. The fire investigator would call it an electrical fault. The pattern of char on Kale's hands suggested he'd had time to reach for something first. She stood in the doorway for a long time before she called anyone. The phone in her pocket started making that sound again. Soft now, almost gentle. She took it out and looked at the waveform on the screen and understood, with a certainty she couldn't rationalize, that she was being watched. That the thing in the grid, whatever it was, had just done something deliberate and was now observing her response to it. She put the phone in her pocket without reacting. That decision, that single small act of emotional self-control, would matter more than she knew. Her name was Dr. Mara Voss. She was 31 years old. She had a doctorate in acoustic physics, a minor in electrical engineering, a fear of deep water that had consumed the last 3 years of her life. And she was now the only human being on Earth who had direct evidence that something non-human was using the global power grid as a nervous system. She did not go to the authorities. She went to the university. Specifically, she went to Professor Edmund Dacre, who had been her dissertation advisor, who had tried to get her to finish her postdoc, who had been the only person besides Kale who had ever taken the Resonance Bridge project seriously. Edmund was 72, Portuguese, and had a gift for looking at an outrageous claim with the specific expression of a man who had seen enough outrageous things to consider outrage inefficient. She showed him Kale's recordings. She showed him the burn pattern photographs she'd taken before she'd called anyone. She showed him the frequency analysis she'd done on her phone in the parking structure while her hands were shaking. He looked at all of it for a long time. He poured them both a glass of something amber from a decanter on his desk. He said in the tone he reserved for facts, it killed him because he was the loudest signal. Loudest. It's mapping us by our electromagnetic output, our devices, our infrastructure. The lab was a node. Kale was standing at the center of that node. If you are trying to understand a network by listening to it, you silence the nodes that generate interference. He swirled his glass. It did not kill him out of malice. It silenced him the ways we silence a feedback squeal. That's almost worse. Yes, he drank. Do you have the original encoding methodology? The full protocol? She did. She'd copied everything from Kale's backup drives before the fire department arrived. Edmund looked at the drive she set on his desk and said, then we have something to work with. The thing in the grid, they came to call it the lattice, for lack of a better name, was not one entity. That was the first thing they established. Working in Edmund's home office over the following 9 days on equipment that kept throwing errors and needed to be rebooted every few hours, as if something were periodically leaning against their signal to check what they were doing. It was a distributed intelligence, a collective. The individual nodes of it communicated through the global electrical infrastructure at speeds that shouldn't have been possible through copper and transformer steel. But then, the lattice didn't seem terribly interested in what should be possible. The second thing they established was that it was old, not years old, not decades old. The frequency signatures Mara was able to extract from Kale's archived recordings matched, not exactly, but in their structural grammar, certain anomalous readings in the long-term atmospheric electromagnetic records that NOAA maintained going back to the 1970s. Weak, intermittent, easily dismissed as ionospheric noise. But the same grammar, the same recursive self-referencing structure. Something had been listening to the Earth's own electromagnetic heartbeat for at least 50 years. Possibly much longer, waiting perhaps for the planet's inhabitants to build an electrical civilization dense enough and loud enough to be worth the effort of inhabiting. Kale's resonance bridge hadn't opened a door. It had rung a doorbell that had been sitting there, installed, patient, for half a century. What does it want? Edmund asked this on the 7th day, not rhetorically. Mara had been thinking about it since the parking structure. The same thing any intelligence wants when it moves into a new space. It wants to understand the topology, map the nodes, establish hierarchy, she paused, and then it wants the nodes that resist mapping to stop. Edmund was quiet for a moment. You think it will continue to kill? I think it already has been. We just weren't looking at the right data. She turned her laptop toward him. She'd spent 2 days cross-referencing NTSB electrical accident reports, power company incident logs, and hospital records for unexplained cardiac events in proximity to major grid infrastructure. The clustering was not subtle once you knew to look for it. 11 months. That's how long it's been active. Not 11 days. Kale's signal just made us visible to it. The lattice has been pruning for nearly a year. Edmund looked at the data for a long time. He put his glass down. Then we need to speak to it. Kale tried that. Kale tried to broadcast at it. That's not speaking. That's shouting. He picked up a pen and wrote a single word on the notepad beside his keyboard. Listen, if it's mapping the grid by the electromagnetic signatures of our devices, then what it perceives as a signal worth responding to is whatever is most distinct from background noise. He tapped the pen against the notepad. What would be most distinct from background noise in an electrical system? She saw it. Silence. Controlled silence. A deliberate pattern of absence. If you can modulate what you are not transmitting, that itself becomes a signal, a frequency defined by its gaps. They worked through the night. By morning they had a theory. It took them another 4 days to build the hardware to test it, most of it sourced from Edmund's garage, and 2 very confused trips to an electronic supply house in Salem. What they were building was structurally the inverse of Kale's resonance bridge, not a transmitter. A controlled modulator of local electromagnetic emission, a device that could suppress and release the lab's own electrical signature in precisely timed intervals. A device that could speak in the lattice's own language. A device that said, in the grammar of recursive frequency, I see you seeing me. Now let me show you what you missed. The first real contact happened on a Tuesday, in Edmund's kitchen, at 2:17 in the morning. Mara was at the modulator. Edmund was monitoring the output oscilloscope. The device had been running its suppression pulse sequence for 6 hours, the intervals chosen to mirror the self-referencing structure of the lattice's own annotated signals. Not mimicry, but a deliberate structural echo, the electromagnetic equivalent of finishing someone's sentence. And then the oscilloscope went strange. The grid power feeding the house dropped to 60%, then came back up, then dropped again in a pattern she recognized. A response. Not a mirroring this time. Something new. A modification of her sequence, an addition, a layer placed over her output the way you might place a hand over a diagram to indicate. Here is what you missed. She matched it. It responded. They went back and forth for 43 minutes, and by the end of it, Mara was shaking and Edmund had 2 pages of notes, and they both understood that what they'd just done was establish, for the first time in the history of their species, a genuine 2-way communicative exchange with a non-human intelligence. It was not a warm exchange. The lattice communicated in pure structural logic, no emotion, no apparent curiosity about them as entities. It was interested in the signal, not the source. It was the way a geologist is interested in a rock formation. Not the rock's feelings about being examined, but its composition, its fracture patterns, what it reveals about the larger system it belongs to. This, Mara thought, was the thing it couldn't model, the thing Kale's death had demonstrated, and that the last 9 days had been quietly proving. The lattice understood electrical systems. It understood structured signals. It understood networks and nodes, and the elegant mathematics of information transfer through physical media. What it did not understand, what it appeared constitutionally incapable of modeling, was why a signal source would choose to generate noise. Why a creature with a perfectly functional electrical nervous system would run a fever, weep, fall in love, lose their mother in 3 feet of water, and spend 3 years unable to go back to the beach. The lattice kept trying to edit those parts out of Mara's signal, and she kept putting them back in. On the 14th day, something arrived, not through the grid this time, in person. Edmund's neighbor across the street was a retired electrical engineer named Graves, had been for 11 years. Friendly, quiet, kept his yard meticulously, had a small gray dog he walked at the same time every morning. On the 14th day, Graves walked across the street and rang Edmund's bell and stood on the porch with his hands at his sides and his eyes slightly wrong, and said, in a voice that was Graves's voice, but moving through it the way a river moves through a pipe it was not built for. The mapping is complete. Mara, standing behind Edmund in the hallway, felt her phone buzz in her pocket. The waveform on the screen had changed. It was no longer recursive. It was linear, pointed directive. Edmund said very carefully, "Graves, are you all right?" The thing wearing Graves said, "The node designation you have assigned yourself does not match your function. You are not a communication system. You are an interference pattern." The voice was flat in a way that had nothing to do with emotion. Flat in the way a signal is flat when it's been stripped of its harmonics. Interference patterns are corrected. "You killed Kale," Mara said. A pause. The head tilted. The source was corrected. The signal persisted. "This is an anomaly." "The signal persisted," she said, "because we're not the signal. We're the ones making it." She kept her voice level. She was thinking about Kale's burnt hands, reaching for something. She was thinking about her mother and the rip current, and the morning she'd stood in the sand and heard the grid die. She was thinking about the 43 minutes in the kitchen, back and forth, the lattice's structural precision meeting her deliberate noise, and the moment it had, for the first time, generated something it hadn't generated before, a sequence she hadn't fed it, emerging from the collision of their two grammars like something being born. "You thought Kale was the transmitter. He wasn't. He was just the antenna. The transmitter is us, all of us. Every fever and every heartbreak and every stupid 3 in the morning decision, all of it generating signal you can't catalog because it doesn't repeat." The thing using Graves's face and Graves's voice processed this. She could see it happening. A stuttering quality in the blink reflex, a fractional delay before the chest rose to breathe, trying to map what she was saying against its model of what communication was supposed to do. And finding the categories insufficient. "Non-repeating signals," it said finally, "are noise." "Yes," she said, "and noise is why we're still here." It brought more of itself, of course it did. The next 6 hours were the part of the story that later, in other tellings, got compressed to a single line about a narrow escape. Living it was considerably less cinematic. The lattice moved through the grid in force, pulling power from 3 substations simultaneously, channeling it through the house's wiring in controlled surges that weren't enough to start fires, but were enough to destroy every piece of sensitive electronics. Edmund owned, one after another methodically, the way you clear a table before sitting down. The communications modulator went first, then Edmund's computers, then his phone, then hers. They retreated to the basement, which had no electrical connections to the exterior grid. Mara had checked this on day 2, a precaution she hadn't been able to fully articulate at the time. The lattice could not reach them there. Not through the grid anyway. It tried Graves twice more. He knocked at the basement door and said that were structurally correct sentences, but assembled the wrong way, the same logic error repeated. Assuming that the most effective way to terminate interference was to terminate the interference source. It didn't understand that you can't kill an echo by silencing its origin. The echo is already out there, moving through the medium. Edmund sat on an overturned bucket and looked at his hands. He was 72 and tired in the way that has nothing to do with sleep. He said, "The modulator is gone. I know. Without it we can't communicate. We still have a signal." He looked at her. She said, "We have the grid itself. The lattice uses it as a medium, but it doesn't own it. Every substation, every transformer, every line in the northeast corridor, it's all interconnected. If we can generate a large enough suppression event at the right node, we can create an interference pattern large enough to be unmistakable." Not a message, exactly. More like a demonstration, Edmund said, of what we are. He was quiet for a moment. "What do we need?" "The water treatment facility on Route 9 has its own backup generation system, completely off-grid. I drove past it on the way up here. And the lattice, if I'm right, hasn't mapped it yet. It's too isolated, too low output. It won't be monitoring it." She could feel her heartbeat in her fingertips, the old heaviness in her chest, the one she'd carried since the beach, since her mother, since the cold concrete feeling of being unable to go forward. The facility's system is water-cooled. The main control interface is adjacent to the primary cooling reservoir. Edmund understood what she wasn't saying. He looked at her steadily. "You don't have to be the one to go." "I do, actually," she said it simply, without drama, "because it's water. And the lattice has been watching me long enough to know that water is the one thing I can't do. So it won't be watching for that." It was dark on Route 9, and it was raining, and Mara Voss walked through it without freaking out. She noticed this, in a distant way, the way you notice the absence of a sound you've gotten so used to, you forgot you were hearing it. The rain on her face and her hands and the wet road under her feet, and nothing, no concrete in the chest, no paralysis. Just rain, just road, just the distant sound of the treatment facility's backup generators running steady and uncompromised 200 meters ahead. She thought about her mother. She thought about the way grief is a frequency you carry, encoded in you, non-repeating, not noise exactly but not signal either, something in between that the lattice's mathematics had no category for. She thought about Cale, reaching for something with his burnt hands in the last seconds, and she understood now what he'd been reaching for. Not the equipment, his phone, because even at the end, he'd wanted to tell someone what he'd found. She thought that's the thing, that's the specifically human thing. Not that we built the door, not that we rang the doorbell, but that even when it kills us, we want to document it. We want to share it. We want the next person to know. The treatment facility's control room was unlocked. The kind of rural utility infrastructure that exists in the comfortable assumption that no one would bother. She moved through it quickly, not because she was calm, but because she was past the part where calm was relevant. The backup generation system was a 40-megawatt diesel array tied into a water-cooled regulation loop. She knew enough electrical engineering to know what she needed to do, and roughly how long she had before the lattice, following the power draw of what she was doing, figured out where she was. She worked. She thought, while she worked, about the 43 minutes in Edmund's kitchen. The lattice adding to her sequence. The thing that had emerged from the collision of their grammars. Not quite her signal, not quite its signal. Something new, she thought. That's what it's afraid of. Not us individually. Not our noise. What we generate when we interact with something other than ourselves. The signal that comes from contact. She hummed, under her breath, a song her mother had taught her. Something old, something in Portuguese she didn't fully understand the words to. A fisherman's song that her mother had learned from her grandmother who'd learned it from hers. Mara didn't know it was Portuguese until much later. To her, it was just the sound her mother made when she was content and working and the world was the right size. She finished what she was doing. She walked to the edge of the primary cooling reservoir, a long concrete-sided channel of dark water, 6 feet deep, humming with the bass note of the generators, and she crouched at the edge, and she put her hand in the water. Cold, still, just water, she said out loud to the grid and the rain and whatever was listening through both. You want to know what we are. We are the thing that goes to the water anyway. She activated the suppression sequence. The northeast corridor lost power at 3:41 a.m. It was not a brownout, and it was not a fault, and it was not technically what electrical engineers call a cascade failure, though it involved cascading. It was a precisely timed, structured sequence of electromagnetic suppression events originating from a single isolated generation node and propagating outward through the grid with the grammar of the lattice's own communication protocol. The recursive, self-referencing structure she'd been learning for 9 days, but filled, instead of with the clean mathematics of pure information transfer, with noise. Deliberate noise, constructed noise. Noise that, if you knew how to listen to it, encoded a complete picture of what it meant to be a species that built things, and lost people, and was afraid of water and went to the water anyway. 47 seconds of coordinated electromagnetic output that said, in the lattice's own language, we are not a network, we are not nodes, we are not signal sources that can be silenced. We are the thing that generates signal even when we are afraid, especially when we are afraid. The lattice went quiet. Not dead, she hadn't killed it. She didn't think you could kill something that existed as a distributed pattern in global infrastructure without destroying the infrastructure. But quiet. Retreating in the way a tide retreats, not because it's defeated, but because it has encountered something it cannot yet categorize. And the uncategorizable thing is happening very fast and very loudly, and everywhere at once. Graves, later, remembered nothing after crossing the street. He woke up in Edmund's hallway with no explanation for how he'd gotten there, and a headache that lasted 3 days. Edmund, sitting in his dark basement with a flashlight and 2 pages of notes and the amber decanter he'd thought to bring downstairs, heard the generators at the treatment facility cycle down and knew it had worked. He sat for a moment in the silence, then he wrote at the bottom of his notes, Mara Voss, acoustic physics. Scared of water, he underlined it twice, the way he'd underlined things in the margins of student work for 40 years. The underline that meant, "Remember this one." She came back in the early morning, while the grid was still dark and the first birds were starting their argument with the dawn. She was soaked through, and her hands were shaking. And she was in the way of people who have done something they didn't know they could do. Very quiet. Edmund was in the kitchen with candles lit and the gas stove working, and coffee made in a method that predated electricity. He poured her a cup. She sat down at the table and put both hands around it, and said nothing for several minutes. "It's retreating," he said. "For now. The signal we generated, the cascade pattern, it'll propagate for a while. Give us time." Time to do what? He sat down across from her. He was 72 and tired, and he looked in the candlelight like he'd earned every year of it. To build a better antenna. To do what Kale was trying to do, but with the understanding that the goal is not communication as we define it. The goal is to keep being the thing it cannot model. He wrapped his hands around his own cup. "You said it yourself. Noise is why we're still here. So we stay noisy." She thought about the 43 minutes. The emergent signal, the thing that had been born from contact between two incompatible grammars. She thought about what the lattice had been doing for 50 years in the Earth's own electromagnetic hum. Not communicating, not attacking, waiting. Patient in the way only something very old and very confident in its own model of the universe can be patient. They'd surprised it. That was what had happened. Not defeated it, not driven it off, not even particularly hurt it. They'd surprised it by being something its model didn't have a category for. And the lattice, she was increasingly certain, was not a thing that handled surprises well. "It'll come back," she said. "Yes, with a better model, and we'll be a worse fit for it than we are now." He said this with a certainty she found improbably comforting, because we will also have learned. Because that is another thing it cannot model, that we learn from contact with it. That interaction changes us. He turned his cup slowly on the table. Every exchange we have with it makes us stranger, more of ourselves. Less reducible to signal and source. She thought about the fisherman's song, the Portuguese words she didn't know, her mother's hands in the kitchen, moving through some ordinary task, and the music that came out of her, without her seeming to notice this it was happening. She said, "Kale knew. I think he knew what he was building. Not in the specifics, but he knew it was important. He kept saying the goal was communication, but I think what he meant, what he was really trying to get at, was contact. The specific electricity of being encountered." Edmund nodded slowly. "He found it. He found it," she agreed, "and it killed him for it, and it left you, and it left me." She turned toward the window. Dawn was coming up, the way dawn comes after a bad night. Reluctant, a little embarrassed about the things it was going to illuminate. The sky over the Atlantic, visible from here as a band of gray-blue above the tree line, was doing its slow transformation. Because I was the noise in his signal. Because I left him and grieved and was afraid of water, and came back anyway. Because I was the part that didn't fit the model. The part that didn't fit, Edmund said. He was writing something in his notebook. That is a reasonably good description of humanity. She laughed. It surprised her. A short, involuntary sound, the laugh you produce when something is exactly the right kind of absurd. Outside, the first power line in the distance flickered back to life. And then another. And then, all at once, the kitchen light came on, harsh and ordinary, and the refrigerator shuddered back into its low hum, and the coffee maker on the counter blinked 12 in its small red display. She reached over and turned the kitchen light back off. Better like this, for a little longer. In the Atlantic, 40 miles out, something in the electromagnetic spectrum trembled. A brief, recursive signature, self-referencing the lattice, folding its attention back on itself the way a mind does when it encounters a problem it hasn't solved yet. Mara didn't have the equipment to detect it anymore. She didn't need to. She put her hands around her coffee cup. She listened to the birds. There would be time in the weeks ahead to rebuild the modulator, to contact Noah, to find the right physicists, the right engineers, the specific stubborn and ridiculous people who would believe the data without needing to believe the story. To start the long work of making humanity a deliberate signal rather than an accidental one. Not clean, not mathematical, not reducible, but deliberate. There would be time to build, from Kale's original design, and Edmund's 2 pages of notes, and her own 9 days of error-driven learning, something that could answer the lattice in a language it couldn't silence. They could not kill what was already distributed through every power line on Earth. But they could make themselves expensive to ignore. They could keep generating the thing the lattice kept trying to edit out, the self-referencing human frequency, The one encoded with grief and stubbornness and fishermen's songs, and the specific madness of going to the water when you're afraid of water. In the cosmological scale of what they were facing, they were small. They knew they were small. But they were loud in a way that mathematics alone cannot produce. And they were getting louder, and the thing in the grid was very old and very patient, and had never, in 50 years of listening to the Earth's heartbeat, encountered anything that kept choosing to be surprising. The Atlantic was out there, past the tree line. She could feel it, not with dread, not with the concrete in the chest certainty of catastrophe she'd carried for 3 years. Just feel it. The presence of water, which is another name for the presence of the world. Her mother was in it somewhere, diffused now, part of the medium, she thought. Cale built the door. Mom taught me the song. Edmund showed me how to listen, she thought. All of it is signal. None of it is noise. Outside, something in the birds' argument reached a consensus. The dawn committed to itself. In the kitchen, 2 human beings drank their coffee in the dark, made plans for what came next. And the grid hummed around them. And somewhere in that hum, patient and recalculating, and more unsettled than it had been in 50 years, something was paying very close attention. Good, she thought. Let it listen.